Okay, this is Assignment Screencast 2, Reproductive Policies, presented by Michael J. Cunningham, Michaela Medved, and Maureen Webb.
We looked at different aspects of reproductive rights and laws, and to understand where it is today, we had to go back in the 17th century. So the laws and legislation began in 1873 when the Comstock law made it illegal to send inappropriate message via the mail. And this included obscenity and information about abortion or birth control. So in the 17th to 19th century, there was very little movement, but that was the beginning of these laws. In 1910 to the 1960s, we had more laws, but there were not as many. It started with Margaret Sanger in 1918 when she was convicted when her conviction was overturned. She was previously convicted of giving information about birth control and contraceptives, and she was charged for that. But in 1918, they overturned it. In 1936, the federal government looked at the law of convicting doctors for giving out contraceptives, and it was said that no one could take a case to the federal government if a doctor chooses to give its clients or its patient contraceptives. In 1959, the American Law Institute began legislation to legalize abortion. So they brought it to the Supreme Court, and that was the beginning of the abortion laws. And in 1968, that law was threatened by Lyndon Johnson's committee. He wanted to reverse the abortion laws. In the 1970s to present, where most of these laws and rights came about more, when more females became verbal, we see many laws addressing abortion. So from 1970s to present, there continue to be changes in the abortion laws at the state and federal level. The laws were many, and we're not going to go into details because that's the purpose of this paper, but a few that will be highlighted are, in 1970, there was a removal of the word contraception from anti-obscenity laws. So both contraception was put into that law, as was told in the from 1873 with the Comstock Act. But this changed as in the 1970s. In 1972, there was the rule that birth control could be given to unmarried couples. Prior to that, it was only married couples who were legally allowed to use birth control. The most popular legislation in the 1970s was the Roe versus Wade case in 1973, where the court allowed abortion in the first trimester. There was limitation on abortion in the second trimester, and this law has been reviewed and changed over the years, but it was a landmark law for women's rights and women's reproductive policies. In 1978, the federal government did a law against discrimination against pregnant women, childbirth, or any illness related to pregnancy. So a company could not dismiss someone because they were pregnant or they were out sick because of that pregnancy. So that law was in 1978. In 1999, we have the banning of intact dilation and extraction. So once the fetus was intact, they could not go in and try to extract that fetus from the mother. That was illegal. In 1999 to 2000 was when there were several laws on the dilation and extraction. In 2000, there was a law where prevented the companies from providing health insurance, who provide health insurance to the worker, from exempting the provision of birth control. This law was brought to the court by Equal Employment Opportunity organization. So in this law, a company cannot deny birth control if they provide health insurance to their female workers. In 2000 as well, there was a prevention of colleges and healthcare providers from participating in the discount drug program. So this was also a very important law, especially for, as we go further in our presentation, because we look at what the colleges are doing and how are they impacting on individuals with contraception. So in 2000, this law took away the discount. So no longer college students and other healthcare providers who, like Planned Parenthood, who give discount drug or free of cost contraceptions to their members, were allowed to do it anymore. They weren't getting those breaks. So they had to find different means of funding for healthcare at the college level and for individuals with poor health care or health insurance. In 2011, United States Department of Health and Human Services brought a case to allow contraception to be taken from copay. So you could be copay for other drugs, but not for contraception. So that was in 2011. In 2014, Burwell and Abbey brought a case where it was about religious institutions and that they could get exemption from providing contraceptions to the female employees. So that was a case that was brought to the Supreme Court to allow religious institutions to say, we do not want to give contraception. This is against our religious beliefs and teaching, so we do not want to do it. And they were allowed to do it. In 2016, All Women Health versus Ellistet brought a case against Texas, who was restricting abortion services that would cause a burden on women and a woman. So in that law, Texas was prohibited from preventing a woman from having abortion if it would be a burden for her. So the Supreme Court allowed this law to come into effect in Texas, so that Texas could not say no to these women who needed to abort their children for whatever reason, their fetus. And in present day, 2017, a law by President Trump opened the doors for more companies to refuse to give birth control based on religion and morality. So in the past, the exemption was strictly religious, but now we expanded it to moral obligation. So if a company feels like it's against their moral belief to provide contraception for their workers, they are allowed to under the new Trump law. So this is a brief overview of the laws as we see, as we saw them, and this was taken from Wikipedia's timeline of legislation related to reproductive rights.
So as an overview, what is a contraceptive mandate? So, a contraceptive mandate is a government regulation which requires employers to provide their employees with health insurance that will cover some contraceptive costs within their plan. So, upon this, the employer exemption from providing contraception eradicates this responsibility from the employer. In May 31st, 2017, Trump drafted a regulation scaling back the federal mandate that employers are to provide free birth control coverage by creating an exemption for those who have either religious or moral objections. Such a change would affect hundreds of thousands of women who have been receiving free contraceptive coverage under the 2010 Affordable Care Act. With this change, employers would be able to opt out of providing coverage and rather be able to notify the insurer to pay for it. Such a ruling would raise constitutional questions given that an attack on birth control coverage is a service that only women use. This could also be considered a direct attack on women's rights. Now let's fast forward to present day, October 6th, 2017, approximately a month ago. The Trump administration took further steps to deny women insurance coverage for contraception. The new rules offer an exemption to an employer which does not believe in covering services associated with contraception if they don't agree with such actions due to either religious beliefs or possible moral convictions. Currently, over 55 million have access to birth control without copay, given the previous contraception coverage mandate, which was issued by the Obama administration under the Affordable Care Act. This mandate sought to remove the cost as a barrier to obtaining birth control, a long-standing goal of advocates for women's rights. With the new regulations, hundreds of thousands of women would lose such benefits. Those who do not support the initial mandate state the rules violate the First Amendment, which blocks government action of respecting an establishment of religion. Conservative religious individuals and organizations have already objected for years to non-discrimination laws that have affected whom they can hire and fire, whom they can serve, and how they can operate. This new directive would simply afford them more liberty. As a result of this, religious charities or schools who receive government funding would potentially be able to fire an unmarried employee who becomes pregnant.
In 2012, contraception was included in the Affordable Care Act. The Health Resources and Services Administration identified key preventative services for women. This included 17 forms of contraception that are approved by the Food and Drug Administration. These forms of contraception were made available at no cost to the insured. The only exemption available at that time was for houses of worship. However, accommodations could be considered for other organizations. In 2016, a survey conducted by the Kaiser Family Foundation and the Washington Post indicated that 77% of women and 64% of men supported the provision of contraception at no cost to the recipient. As of October 6, 2017, under the Trump administration, the exemption for the provision of contraceptive coverage, which was required under the Affordable Care Act, has been significantly broadened. Exemptions now include a variety of businesses and educational institutions that claim religious beliefs or moral objections related to the use of contraception. The 17 forms of contraception currently approved by the FDA would no longer be available at no cost to employees, their dependents, or students who attend universities that object to the use of contraception. Included, but not limited to, the organizations which are exempt are organizations including churches, the integrated auxiliary of the church, a convention or association of churches, a religious order, nonprofit organizations, a closely held for-profit entity, a for-profit entity that is not closely held, any other non-governmental employee, or an institution of higher education. This exemption is provided based upon religious beliefs as well as moral objections. However, moral objections have not been defined. These exemptions will affect all female employees, the dependents of any employee, and all students who attend an institution of higher education that provides healthcare coverage plans but will not cover the provision of contraception. Previously, under the Obama administration, employers had the right to an objection which would provide them access to accommodation for not providing access to contraception at no cost to the recipient. Under this provision, the third-party administrator or insurer covered the cost. Therefore, contraception was made available to employees and their dependents at no costs. This graphic displays employers objecting to contraceptive coverage and the exemptions and accommodations under the Trump administration regulations. Under the Trump administration, the employer is no longer obligated to cover any of the 17 FDA-approved forms of contraception. The employee and/or the employee's dependents are no longer entitled to access to contraception at no cost. Under the optional accommodation, any employer can contact the third-party administrator to report their objection. The third-party administrator can then provide access to contraception. It is only mandatory for the following companies to provide access to contraception, and those would be employers with no religious or moral objections, however, moral objections have yet to be defined, and publicly traded for-profit companies with no religious objections. As per the September 2016 survey conducted by the Guttmacher Institute, 99% of women in the United States have used contraception at one point in their life. Contraception has previously made up 30 to 44% of out-of-pocket healthcare costs for women. There was a 63% decline in cost under the Affordable Care Act. This amounted to a total of $1.4 billion in savings for out-of-pocket expenses for access to contraception, which is accessed by women. This graphic indicates that from 2004 to 2012, under the Bush administration, 22.5 to 20.9% of insured women reported out-of-pocket expenses for access to contraception. From 2012 to 2015, under the Obama administration, with the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, that number dropped to 3% of insured women. Under the Affordable Care Act, with no cost provision to access to the 17 forms of birth control approved by the FDA, women selected long-term, more effective forms of birth control. Previously, these forms of birth control were cost prohibitive. By decreasing access to contraception, the implications include an increased rate of unintended pregnancies and an increase in costs associated with childbirth. There's also likely to be less adherence to the use of contraception. A 2016 research study by Pace, Dutsina, and Keating reported that a co-payment of as little as $6 increased the discontinuation and decreased the adherence to the use of generic oral contraceptives by women. 8 states have laws related to contraceptive requirements, and 20 states have legislation relative to contraceptive equity. Contraceptive equity means that if states require access to other prescription medications, healthcare insurers must also provide access to contraception. However, this does not include all 17 forms of contraception approved by the FDA. This disparity between federal and state law presents the potential for future litigation relative to religious exemptions. Employers in those 28 states will need to follow state regulations, although they may be eligible for federal exemption. under the Affordable Care Act, there was no mandate that colleges or universities must offer health coverage. The current administration has proposed that with the provision of exemptions and accommodations, colleges and universities that previously would not provide health coverage may now offer it based upon the ability to deny access to contraception. Therefore, it's posited that this new legislation has removed an obstacle to health care for students and their dependents. Within the religious exemptions and accommodations for coverage of certain preventative services under the Affordable Care Act, it's reported that the exemptions and accommodations will affect 1,462 women, or 8,700 women. There's no explanation as to how the number 8,700 was reached. However, the total of 1,462 women was reached as follows. This is exclusively based on the litigating entities, meaning those colleges and universities that filed for exemptions or accommodations or sued under the provision put forward by the Affordable Care Act. It was reported that this litigation affected a total of 3,300 students. There is an assumption that 50% of students are female. In order to reach an upper boundary, it was decided that each of these female students would have one dependent. Therefore, it would affect a total of 3,300 students. There was also an assumption that 44.3% of these female students used contraception. Assuming that 55.7% were either not of childbearing age, which is defined within this act as 15 to 44 years, and there's also an assumption that these female students would not have dependents of childbearing age. So this would leave a total of 1,462 women affected by these changes. However, the religious exemptions and accommodations for coverage of certain preventative services under the Affordable Care Act references the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. There is no data on the CCCU website relative to the number of participating colleges or universities. A Google query of how many Christian colleges are there in the United States yielded a result of 600 Christian colleges. A follow-up query of what is the average number of students in a college yielded the following information. A small college is considered to have less than 5,000 students. A medium-sized college is considered to have between 5,000 and 15,000 students, and a large college is described as one having greater than 15,000 students. The majority of colleges are considered to be medium-sized. Therefore, assuming the majority of Christian colleges and universities are medium-sized is reasonable. If there are 600 Christian colleges and universities, assuming a conservative estimate of 10,000 students per college or university, that would result in a total of 6 million students attending Christian colleges and universities. 57% of college students are female, as per the 2010 census. That would yield 3,420,000 students who would be affected by the new exemptions. Using the 44.3% estimate of the number of women who use contraception based on this new exemption legislation, that would indicate a total of 1,515,060 students affected by this new legislation. Therefore, there is a significant discrepancy between the number of students reported to be affected in the religious exemptions and accommodations for coverage of certain preventative services under the Affordable Care Act and the actual number of students who may be affected. It's also reported within the religious exemptions and accommodations for coverage of certain preventative services under the Affordable Care Act that there are currently 34,000 employees affected by these exemptions. Again, this is based solely on the litigating entities. The assumption is that if there are 34,000 employees affected, and each of those employees has one dependent, the total number of affected individuals would be 68,000 people. If only 20.2% of the population are women of childbearing age, and only 44.3% of that 20.2% are women who use contraception, then a total number of 7,221 women will be affected based on these litigating entities. Those numbers clearly are not accurate, as there are far more women than that in the United States that will be affected by the religious exemptions and accommodations for coverage of certain preventative services under the Affordable Care Act. This policy relates most closely with elite theory. This theory, which seems to indicate that a small percentage of the very wealthy and elite run the United States. This belief is that wealth equals power. the economic elite therefore equal the political elite. Although the economic elite have not historically held government positions, there have been very wealthy elected officials, such as the Rockefellers, the Bushes, and members of the current administration. The elite theory posits a top-down exertion of power, meaning a small percentage of the very wealthy control the power to affect the masses. This happens to be the reverse of the democratic theory. The elite theory includes the use of negative labeling of the have-nots. It appeals to people's emotions, sanctions, and powerlessness felt by the group. Exemption and accommodations, and removing the entitlement of contraception at no cost, would appeal financially to the elite and emotionally to the have-nots. Denial of access to no-cost contraception based on religious beliefs would appeal to people's emotions, and claiming moral objection to the use of contraception would empower those who have the ability to deny access to contraception to those that might access contraception.
The other theory that we looked at was social cognitive theory, effective reproductive policies. In the social cognitive theory, according to Wikipedia, it includes the portions of an individual's knowledge acquisition can be directly related to observing others within the context of social interactions, experiences, and outside media influences. So this theory looks at three components: cognition, behavior, and environment. And for us, it's overall, each one is broken down differently. The cognitive factors we look at was knowledge, expectations, and attitudes. So knowledge empowers one. So when women became empowered, became knowledgeable of their rights, they began to expect things to happen, and their attitude changed within the environment. So this depiction of, first the baby learns to crawl, and then the baby sits up, and, this is all going through the brain. So that's the same concept that these legislation are based on, because once women became knowledgeable of what their rights are, and they expected these rights to be upheld, and though their attitude changed in fighting these rights, so they now bring legislation, and that's part of how the cognitive factor influenced the changes in reproductive policies. The next factor is behavioral. In behavioral factor, one acquires a skill, then they practice, and then they become self-efficient. So in the beginning, women had little or no rights, so they had to acquire the skill of knowing how to fight their legal rights. So women became lawyers, and they practiced these women's rights, and under the movement, the women rights movement, according to Eisenberg and Rothschild, 1998, who gave a breakdown of the history of the women's rights movement, is, she quoted Margaret Mead. They quoted Margaret Mead of saying, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's only the thing that ever has." So they learned that they needed to not only be knowledgeable, but acquire those skills that would help them to change these behaviors. And as they got better at it by practicing and bringing legislation to the women's movement, there was an overall empowerment of these women to make a difference, to understand that our bodies are, that women's bodies are our own, and they should decide what and where and how to deal with their body. And the third aspect of this theory was the environmental factor. In the environmental factor, it was broken down into social norms, access in the community, influence on others, and environment. So the society began to change in the 1960s to 70s. As noted in the timeline earlier, there were very little laws in 1873. But as we got closer and closer to the 1900s and the 2800s, we saw more changes happening, and women, and this was due to a lot of the social aspects of our society. Women now was in the workforce more. They had a say in social events such as, political events. So now they were running for offices. They were CEOs. They were on boards. So the social climate lended itself to increase. And now they also have access in the community, which is from a political point of view of accessing care, accessing their rights, and using the courts in their best interest. Another thing is they now can influence others and the environment because they had a say. So environmental factors was one of the most important pieces of the social cognitive theory for the woman. So we have the knowledge empowered the woman. So they learned, they read, and then they got empowered and they did what they needed to do within their legal rights. And that helped them to become more vocal, and because now they know what they needed and what they should do. The other area that they became empowered was in the environment. There was a shift in power of the women. You had more women in the workforce. You had more women who was in the media being an important piece of any movement that needs to be happening, and accessibility. So the women's impact of these aspects of the social cognitive theory have helped move the women's rights movement for productive rights over the years. So to sum up, we could say knowledge empowers one. So when women became knowledgeable of their rights, they began to change their behaviors, impacting on social norms. Led by the women's movement, and specifically by Margaret Sanger in her role in fighting and giving out information about contraception to women when it was not the norm to do so in 1918, we found women became empowered and demonstrated to effect change within our society. So today, a lot of the reproductive legal rights came about by women being socially, cognitively informed about what their rights are.